Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, Before the Storm. Vincent Vinny Delacroix had built his life on precision. At 38, he owned 3 successful auto repair shops across Portland, employing 27 people who respected him not just as a boss, but as a man who kept his word. His hands, permanently stained with motor oil despite countless scrubbing, were steady hands that could rebuild an engine blindfolded or gently bandage his son's scraped knee with equal expertise. Growing up in the foster system had taught Vinny that family wasn't about blood. It was about choice, loyalty, and showing up when it mattered. When he met Diane Roswell at a community college night class 15 years ago, she seemed to understand that philosophy. She was studying to be a dental hygienist, working double shifts at a diner to pay her way through school. Her determination matched his own, and when she laughed at his terrible jokes about carburetors, he knew he'd found his person. Their son Trevor came 3 years later, a boy with Vinny's dark hair and Diane's infectious smile. Trevor inherited his father's mechanical curiosity, spending countless Saturday mornings in the shop, learning to identify tools and asking endless questions about how things worked. At 14, he could change oil and check brake pads better than most adults. Diane had evolved from the driven student into someone different over the years. Success had come easily after graduation. Dr. Manning's dental practice hired her immediately, and her natural charm with patients made her indispensable. But success bred entitlement. She began working late more often, joining the dental office's social circle, attending conferences that stretched into long weekends. The first crack in their foundation came when Trevor was diagnosed with leukemia at age 13. Vinny immediately reorganized his entire business, promoting his most trusted mechanic, Lou Garrett, to manager so he could spend maximum time at the hospital. He learned every detail of Trevor's treatment, befriended the nurses, and turned the sterile hospital room into a makeshift workshop where he and Trevor designed impossible cars and dreamed about cross-country road trips they'd take when Trevor got better. Diane, however, seemed to retreat. She showed up for the major appointments and the serious conversations with doctors, but she couldn't handle the day-to-day grind of illness. She'd arrive with flowers and cheerful smiles, stay for an hour, then leave for urgent work matters. Vinny understood grief manifested differently in everyone, so he carried the weight alone, sleeping in hospital chairs and advocating fiercely for his son's care. When Trevor died 8 months later, just 2 weeks shy of his 15th birthday, Vinny felt like someone had reached into his chest and torn out everything that mattered. The funeral was held on a rainy Thursday in March. Vinny delivered the eulogy, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. He talked about Trevor's curiosity, his kindness, his dreams of designing cars that would help people. He promised his son that his memory would live on in every engine Vinny repaired, every person he helped. But even in his grief, Vinny noticed things. Diane's phone buzzing constantly during the service. Her frequent trips to the bathroom. The way she barely cried, while Vinny could hardly breathe through his tears. He attributed it to her way of processing loss. Everyone grieved differently, he told himself. She needed space, and he needed to honor that. The wake was held at their home, a modest 3-bedroom house that Vinny had renovated himself room by room. Friends from the shop, customers who'd become family, neighbors, and Trevor's friends filled every corner. People shared stories about Trevor, how he'd helped Mrs. Patterson next door fix her lawnmower, how he'd organized a car wash to raise money for the animal shelter, how he'd always had a smile and a bad dad joke ready. Vinny moved through the crowd, accepting condolences and making sure everyone had food and drinks. It was easier to take care of others than to sit still with his own pain. But as the evening wore on and the last guest trickled out, he realized he hadn't seen Diane for the last hour. He found her in their bedroom, not crying or processing grief, but carefully applying makeup and styling her hair. When he asked if she was okay, she barely looked at him. "I need some air," she said. "I'm going for a drive." She didn't come home that night. Chapter 2, The Unthinkable. Diane returned the next morning with coffee and bagels, acting as if staying out all night after her son's funeral was perfectly normal. When Vinny asked where she'd been, she claimed she'd driven to the coast and slept in her car, needing space to think. The explanation fell hollow, but Vinny was drowning in his own grief and desperate to believe anything that meant his wife was still the woman he'd married. The following week passed in a blur of thank you cards, insurance paperwork, and the overwhelming silence that filled the house where Trevor's laughter used to echo. Vinny threw himself into physical tasks, reorganizing Trevor's room, fixing everything that needed repair around the house, working 16-hour days at the shop. Movement kept the worst of the grief at bay. Diane, meanwhile, seemed oddly energized. She cleaned obsessively, rearranged furniture, and talked about fresh starts and new chapters. When Vinny suggested they might want to talk to a grief counselor together, she dismissed the idea, claiming work was therapy enough. 2 weeks after the funeral, on a cold Tuesday evening, Vinny came home early from the shop, exhausted and hoping to convince Diane to order takeout and maybe watch a movie together. They needed to start rebuilding their connection, finding ways to support each other through this impossible loss. Instead, he found Diane in the kitchen with a man he'd never seen before. Tall and lean, with carefully styled blonde hair and expensive clothes, the stranger was leaning against Vinny's counter, drinking Vinny's beer, while Diane giggled like a teenager. "Vinny," Diane's voice was bright but artificial. "This is Rick Chandler. He's the new dental technician at the office. I invited him for dinner." Rick extended a manicured hand and a politician's smile. "Sorry for your loss, man. Diane's told me all about your son. Real tragedy." The casual way this stranger referenced Trevor, his son, his boy, his heart, made Vinny's blood freeze. But he shook the offered hand and muttered appropriate pleasantries, confusion overriding anger. Maybe Diane had invited a work friend over to distract herself. Maybe this was her way of coping. Dinner was surreal. Rick dominated the conversation, sharing anecdotes about his previous job in Los Angeles, his plans to elevate the practice's technology, and his philosophy about living life to the fullest. He spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room, and treated Vinny with the polite condescension one might show a simple tradesman. What disturbed Vinny most was how Diane responded, laughing too loudly at Rick's jokes, touching his arm when she made points, and acting like a different person entirely. This wasn't the woman who used to fall asleep reading dental journals, or who got excited about new techniques for cleaning stubborn plaque. This was someone performing, and Vinny couldn't understand for whose benefit. After Rick left around 10 p.m., with promises to do this again soon, Vinny tried to talk to Diane about how strange the evening had felt. She accused him of being jealous and antisocial, claiming she was just trying to maintain normal relationships while he wallowed in his grief. "Maybe if you made an effort to move forward instead of treating our house like a shrine, we could start healing," she said before disappearing into the bathroom for an hour-long shower. Over the next few days, Rick's presence became a regular occurrence. He showed up for dinner Wednesday, stopped by Saturday afternoon to check on Diane, and called the house at odd hours. When Vinny answered, Rick would ask for Diane with the familiarity of an old friend, not a recent colleague. Sunday morning, Vinny woke to find Diane already dressed and applying makeup. "Rick's picking me up for brunch," she announced. "The whole office crew is going to that new place downtown." But when Vinny called the office later to speak with Diane about Trevor's memorial fund, the receptionist mentioned that Dr. Manning was at his daughter's soccer game, and most of the staff had the weekend off. When he asked about Rick Chandler, there was a long pause. "I'm sorry, we don't have anyone by that name working here." Vinny hung up the phone, his hands shaking not from grief, but from a terrible understanding beginning to dawn. Chapter 3. The Slap That Changed Everything. That Sunday night, Vinny waited in the dark living room for Diane to return from her supposed office brunch. She came home at nearly midnight, humming softly and moving with the loose contentment of someone who'd had an excellent day. "How was brunch?" Vinny asked from the shadows. Diane jumped, then laughed nervously. "God, you scared me. It was nice. We went to that place on Burnside, then walked around the waterfront. I called the office today," Vinny said quietly. "There's no Rick Chandler working there." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. In the dim light from the street lamp outside, Vinny watched his wife's face cycle through surprise, calculation, and finally defiance. "You call my work to check up on me?" Her voice rose with practiced indignation. "What's wrong with you?" "Diane, who is Rick Chandler?" She turned away, busying herself with hanging up her jacket. He was a consultant. He finished his contract this week." "Stop lying to me." The words hung in the air between them. Vinny had never spoken to her like that before. Direct, uncompromising, demanding truth. In their 15 years together, he'd always given her the benefit of the doubt, always chosen to trust rather than question. Diane turned back to face him, and for a moment, he saw something in her expression he'd never seen before, something cold and calculating. "Fine," she said. "You want the truth? Rick is someone who makes me feel alive again. Someone who doesn't want to spend every waking moment mourning the past. Our son died 3 weeks ago." "I know when my son died," she snapped. "But life goes on, Vinny. Some of us want to live it." "How long?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Does it matter? How long, Diane?" She stared at him for a long moment, then shrugged with a casualness that felt like a physical blow. 6 months. We met at a dental conference in Seattle. He was representing an equipment company. 6 months. While Trevor was fighting for his life. While Vinny was sleeping in hospital chairs and learning about white blood cell counts and chemotherapy protocols. While their son was asking why Mommy seemed so distracted during her visits. "You've been seeing him since Trevor was sick?" "Don't make this about Trevor," Diane said, her voice hardening. "This is about you and me. About how we grew apart. About how you became so obsessed with being the perfect, grieving father that you forgot you had a wife." "I forgot I had a wife." Vinny stood up, his control finally cracking. "I was trying to save our son. And what about saving our marriage?" The question hit him like a slap. How could she twist his dedication to their dying child into a failure as a husband? How could she make her betrayal his fault? "Get out," he said quietly. "What?" "I said get out. Pack a bag and leave." Diane laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "This is my house too, Vinny. Half of everything we built together. You can't just..." "Just 2 weeks after my son's funeral, my wife brought her new lover to live with us," Vinny said, his voice growing stronger. "When I spoke up, she acted like I was the problem. Now I'm saying get out." "Rick's not moving in," Diane said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Isn't he? Because it seems like he's been here every day this week. Drinking my beer, eating my food, sleeping in my bed when I'm not here." Her face flushed. "You don't know what you're talking about. Then prove me wrong. Choose. Him or me." The silence that followed was answer enough. Diane straightened her shoulders and looked at him with something approaching pity. "You're living in the past, Vinny. Trevor's gone, and no amount of your obsessive grief is going to bring him back. Rick helps me focus on the future." "On your future," Vinny corrected. "On your life without the inconvenience of a grieving husband. If you can't handle..." "Just 2 weeks after my son's funeral, my wife brought her new lover to live with us. When I spoke up, she slapped me hard and shouted, 'If you can't handle it, get out.' I left with nothing, and no one cared." Those weren't his words. They were the words he'd write years later, in court documents and victim impact statements. But in that moment, watching his wife choose her affair over their marriage while their son's memorial flowers were still fresh, Vinny saw his future with perfect clarity. Diane raised her hand and slapped him hard across the face. The sound echoed through their living room like a gunshot. "If you can't handle it, get out," she shouted. Vinny felt something inside him die that had nothing to do with grief. This was different from losing Trevor. That had been a cruel act of nature, a medical tragedy that no one could control. This was betrayal, deliberate and calculated and chosen. He looked at his wife of 15 years, the mother of his dead son, and felt something new taking root where his trust used to live. Something cold and patient and absolutely unforgiving. "Okay," he said quietly, touching his stinging cheek. "I'll go." He packed a single bag and left that night. He didn't look back. Chapter 4. The Descent. Vinny moved into a studio apartment above a Vietnamese restaurant on Division Street. The place smelled like pho and motor oil from the auto shop next door, a sense that reminded him of his old life without the painful memories attached to his house. The apartment came furnished with a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and nothing else. It was perfect. He had no desire for comfort. The first month was a blur of legal consultations and sleepless nights. Diane had immediately filed for divorce and temporary spousal support, claiming Vinny had abandoned the marriage. Her lawyer, a sharp woman named Beverly Morse, painted a picture of a controlling husband who couldn't handle his wife's need for social support during their mutual grief. Vinny's court-appointed attorney, an overworked public defender named Tim Walsh, was competent but overwhelmed. During their first meeting, Walsh delivered the harsh reality. Oregon was a no-fault divorce state. Diane's affair wouldn't impact the division of assets significantly, and her request for spousal support had merit given her lower income. But she was cheating while our son was dying, Vinny protested. I understand your anger, Walsh replied, but the court focuses on financial need, not moral judgments. She makes $45,000 as a dental hygienist. You own 3 businesses worth approximately $2 million combined. The math is simple. What Walsh didn't know, what nobody knew except Lou Garrett, Vinny's most trusted employee, was that the businesses were leveraged to the breaking point. Vinny had borrowed heavily against all 3 shops to pay for Trevor's experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. They'd flown to Houston for a clinical trial, to Seattle for a specialist consultation, to Mexico for an alternative therapy that cost $30,000 out of pocket. Every penny had been worth it for the chance to save his son. But now, facing the prospect of liquidating his life's work to pay Diane's spousal support while she lived with her lover, Vinny felt the full weight of his financial reality. The shops were breaking even, but barely. The debt service ate up most of the profit, and without Vinny's daily management, small problems were becoming expensive repairs. Lou was talented, but inexperienced with the business side. Customers were starting to drift away, sensing the instability. Diane, meanwhile, wasn't content to wait for the divorce settlement. 3 weeks after Vinny moved out, she showed up at his apartment with Rick in tow. They waited in the parking lot until Vinny came home from work, then approached him together. "We need to talk," Diane announced. Rick stood slightly behind her, wearing an expensive suit and the satisfied expression of a man who'd won something valuable. "No hard feelings, right, buddy? These things happen." Vinny looked at the man who was living in his house, sleeping in his bed, probably sitting in Trevor's room, sorting through the belongings of a dead boy he'd never met. "What do you want?" "I'm willing to buy out your share of the house," Rick said, pulling out a folded paper. "I've had it appraised. Market value is $420. I'll give you $210 cash today. Clean break." The house was worth closer to $500,000. Vinny had spent years renovating it himself, but it was also mortgaged for $350. Rick's offer would leave him with virtually nothing after paying off the loan. "That's generous," Diane added, not meeting Vinny's eyes. "It would solve a lot of problems for both of us." Vinny studied the paper, buying time while his mind worked. Rick's confidence suggested he had resources, real resources, the kind that didn't come from a dental technician's salary. "I'll think about it," Vinny said finally. "Don't think too long," Rick replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The offer won't stay on the table forever." After they left, Vinny sat in his sparse apartment and began to plan. Not the emotional reaction they expected, not the desperate moves of a broken man, but the methodical preparation of someone who understood that revenge was a dish best served with infinite patience. He called in favors from old customers, men who owed him money or time or loyalty. Within a week, he knew Rick Chandler's real story. Rick wasn't a dental technician. He was a professional grifter who specialized in targeting recently widowed or divorced women with assets. His real name was Robert Christopher Henley, and he had a history spanning 3 states. He'd married a widow in Phoenix and disappeared with her life insurance money. He'd convinced a divorced teacher in Sacramento to refinance her house and vanished with the proceeds. He was good at what he did, patient, charming, and utterly without conscience. Diane wasn't his first mark in Portland, just his most recent. He was living off her income while setting up his next score. The expensive clothes, the cash offer on the house, it was all part of the con. He was positioning himself to control Diane's assets, then disappear when the timing was right. The knowledge should have motivated Vinny to warn his wife, to try to save her from becoming another victim. Instead, he felt something different: opportunity. If Rick was a predator, then Diane had chosen to become prey. She destroyed their marriage for a man who was planning to destroy her. The poetic justice was almost beautiful. But Vinny's plans went deeper than simply watching his wife get conned. Rick had made one crucial mistake. He'd threatened Vinny directly, treated him like a fool to be easily disposed of. That required a response. And 8 years later, when Vinny finally stood before them in court, what he did that day would make them understand exactly how costly that mistake had been. Chapter 5: The Long Game. For 6 months, Vinny played the part of the defeated ex-husband perfectly. He agreed to the divorce terms, signed over half the house value to Diane, and took a modest settlement that left him with enough to keep one auto shop running. To everyone watching, including Diane and Rick, he appeared broken and financially ruined. In reality, he was building. The Vietnamese restaurant owner below his apartment, Mrs. Nguyen, had a son who was a computer programmer and a gambling problem. When Andy Nguyen owed the wrong people $12,000, Vinny paid the debt in exchange for certain services. Andy was talented with technology and desperate enough to avoid asking too many questions about his new employer's requests. Vinny also cultivated a relationship with Jimmy the Fish Torino, a small-time bookie who ran numbers out of a barbershop on the east side. Jimmy owed Vinny $3,000 for transmission work on his Cadillac, and Vinny offered to forgive the debt in exchange for information and occasional assistance with matters that required discretion. Most importantly, Vinny reconnected with Marcus Wade, his cellmate during a brief stint in county jail 15 years earlier. Marcus had been inside for burglary, Vinny for a bar fight that went too far. They'd bonded over a shared understanding that the system was rigged against men like them, and they'd stayed in touch after release. Marcus now ran a successful private security company, the kind that asked few questions about their assignments. The plan Vinny conceived was elegant in its complexity. He wouldn't simply expose Rick's con or try to save Diane from her own choices. Instead, he would orchestrate a scenario where Rick's past victims would have their justice. Diane would face consequences for her betrayal, and Vinny would emerge with everything he'd lost, plus interest. Phase 1 involved documenting Rick's activities with methodical precision. Andy Nguyen installed tracking software on Rick's phone, hacked his email accounts, and monitored his financial transactions. Jimmy Torino spread word through his network that someone was asking questions about Rick Chandler, forcing Rick to pay attention to potential threats from his past. Within 3 months, Vinny had a complete picture of Rick's operation. The man was even more dangerous than initial investigation had revealed. He wasn't just conning women. He was running identity theft schemes, credit card fraud, and small-scale money laundering. He used each Mark's home as a base of operations, then moved on when the heat got too close. Diane, meanwhile, was being systematically isolated from her friends and family. Rick convinced her that people were jealous of their happiness, that Vinny was spreading lies about him, that she needed to cut ties with anyone who didn't support their relationship. He took control of her finances gradually, convincing her to add his name to her accounts for convenience, then making investments and purchases without her knowledge. By winter, Diane had lost contact with most of her social circle and was completely dependent on Rick financially and emotionally. To outsiders, they looked like a happy couple. In reality, she was being groomed for a larger theft. Phase 2 began when Vinny made his first move against Rick's operation. Using information from Andy's surveillance, he anonymously tipped the FBI to Rick's credit card fraud schemes. Not enough to get him arrested immediately, but enough to put him under investigation. Simultaneously, Marcus Wade began reaching out to Rick's previous victims through the private investigator network. Instead of simply gathering information, they offered these women something unprecedented: a chance for justice and restitution. Vinny was building a coalition of her own, funded by the money he'd secretly saved by living in poverty while maintaining the appearance of a struggling ex-husband. Every woman Rick had destroyed would have the opportunity to confront him together, with resources and legal support they'd never had individually. But the centerpiece of Vinny's plan was more personal. Through Andy's monitoring, he discovered that Rick was planning to marry Diane in Las Vegas during the spring. After the wedding, he would convince her to take out a massive home equity loan against the house that was half Vinny's under the divorce settlement. Then he would disappear with the money, leaving Diane bankrupt and Vinny legally responsible for half the debt. It was a brilliant scam, and it would have worked against a normal ex-husband. But Vinny wasn't normal anymore. Trevor's death had burned away everything soft and trusting in him. Diane's betrayal had taught him that loyalty was a weakness others would exploit. He'd become something new, patient, calculating, and utterly without mercy for those who'd chosen to be his enemies. The wedding was set for April 15th. Vinny had 6 months to complete his preparations. On a snowy evening in January, exactly 1 year after Trevor's death, Vinny sat in his sparse apartment and wrote a letter to his son. He told Trevor about the plan, about the justice that was coming, about how sometimes being a good man meant doing terrible things to terrible people. He sealed the letter in an envelope and placed it in his safe deposit box, along with documentation of every crime Rick had committed and every step of Vinny's investigation. If something happened to him, Marcus Wade had instructions to deliver everything to the FBI and the media. But Vinny didn't intend for anything to happen to him. He intended to be very much alive to watch Rick and Diane face the consequences of their choices. 8 years later, when he finally stood before them in court, they would learn what those consequences were. Chapter 6: The Perfect Storm. As Rick and Diane's Vegas wedding approached, Vinny's network moved into position like pieces on a chessboard. Everything had to happen simultaneously to prevent Rick from escaping or destroying evidence. The wedding was scheduled for Saturday, April 15th. On Wednesday the 12th, Vinny received confirmation that all elements were ready. Rick's previous victims, 7 women from 4 states, had been secretly organized into a coordinated legal assault. Each had filed civil suits in their respective jurisdictions, all scheduled to be served simultaneously on Monday morning. The FBI had built an airtight case for federal fraud charges, waiting only for Rick to commit his next major crime to justify a high-profile arrest. Most importantly, Andy and Gwen had discovered Rick's exit strategy. He maintained 3 separate identities with corresponding bank accounts and credit cards. On April 20th, 5 days after the wedding, he planned to transfer the home equity loan money to an offshore account, then vanish using a passport in the name of Michael Thompson. Diane knew nothing about any of this. She was planning their wedding with the excitement of a woman who believed she'd found her soulmate. Vinny watched through surveillance photos as she shopped for a dress, chose flowers, and called venues. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. She was planning the celebration of her own destruction. Friday night, April 14th, Vinny flew to Las Vegas. He checked into the Bellagio under an assumed name, 2 floors above the suite where Rick and Diane would spend their wedding night. Marcus Wade was already in position with the surveillance team. Jimmy Torino had arrived with 2 associates who specialized in what he called aggressive debt collection. The wedding was held at a tacky chapel on the Strip, attended only by Diane and Rick plus 2 witnesses they had hired from a service. Vinny watched from across the street, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap, feeling nothing as his ex-wife pledged her love to a man who was planning to destroy her life. After the ceremony, Rick and Diane had dinner at an expensive restaurant in their hotel. Vinny could have crashed their celebration, could have warned Diane what was coming, could have given her one last chance to walk away. Instead, he returned to his room and waited. At 2:47 a.m., Marcus Wade called with confirmation. Rick had accessed his computer and begun the process of setting up the home equity loan. He was working with a corrupt mortgage broker in Portland who specialized in fast approvals for clients who asked no questions. By Monday, Rick would have a check for $350,000, money secured by Diane's house and Vinny's legal liability as co-owner. At 3:15 a.m., Vinny made a phone call that would change everything. "This is Agent Sarah Mitchell." The FBI agent answered on the first ring. "It's time," Vinny said simply. Are you certain? Once we move, there's no going back. I'm certain. The arrest will happen Monday morning when he attempts to deposit the check. Are you prepared for the fallout? Vinny looked out his hotel window at the lights of Las Vegas, thinking about Trevor, about the betrayal that had destroyed his marriage, about the years of careful planning that had led to this moment. I've been prepared for 8 years. Monday morning, April 18th, Rick drove to his corrupt mortgage broker's office in Northeast Portland to finalize the home equity loan. He was dressed in an expensive suit, carrying a briefcase, and driving Diane's BMW. He believed he was 96 hours away from disappearing forever with enough money to start fresh somewhere else. Instead, he walked into the largest federal fraud sting operation in Oregon state history. The mortgage broker's office had been under FBI surveillance for 6 months. Rick's arrival with fraudulent documentation and identity papers was the final piece of evidence they needed. As he signed the loan papers that would steal Diane's house and destroy her credit, federal agents burst through the doors with weapons drawn. Robert Christopher Henley, you're under arrest for federal fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. Rick's first instinct was to run. His second was to claim innocence. His third was to demand a lawyer. All three failed. The evidence against him filled 14 boxes: surveillance footage, financial records, testimony from previous victims, and digital forensics that traced every crime back to its source. Andy Nguyen's computer work had been thorough enough to impress the FBI's own cybercrimes unit. But the real surprise came when the agents also arrested the mortgage broker, 2 bank officials, and a real estate attorney who'd been facilitating Rick's schemes. Vinny's investigation had uncovered an entire network of corruption that the FBI had been hunting for years. As Rick was being processed into federal custody, Diane was served with civil suits from 7 different women seeking restitution for crimes committed by her new husband. She was also informed that her marriage was invalid. Rick's previous marriage in Arizona had never been legally dissolved. By Tuesday morning, Diane's world had completely collapsed. Her husband was a federal fugitive who'd been using her identity for fraud. Her house was in foreclosure due to mortgage irregularities. Her bank accounts were frozen pending investigation, and she had no one to call for help because Rick had convinced her to cut ties with everyone who'd ever cared about her. Everyone except Vinny. Chapter 7. The Reckoning Begins. Diane called Vinny from a payphone outside the federal courthouse on Tuesday afternoon. Her voice was small and broken, nothing like the confident woman who'd slapped him and demanded he leave his own home. They took everything, she said without preamble. The house, the cars, my bank accounts. They say he was married to someone else. That nothing we did was legal. Vinny listened without speaking, standing in his auto shop office where he'd returned to rebuild his life one customer at a time. Through the window, he could see Lou Garrett training a new mechanic, the business finally thriving again after years of careful growth. I need help, Diane continued. I don't have anywhere to go. No money for a lawyer. The FBI wants me to testify, but they won't tell me if I'm in trouble too. What do you want from me? Vinny asked quietly. I don't know. I call my sister, but she won't talk to me. My friends from work say they can't get involved. You're the only person who what? The only person who might not hate me enough to hang up. Vinny closed his eyes, remembering the night she'd chosen Rick over their marriage. The sound of her palm striking his face, the years of silence that followed. Why would I help you? Because I know I destroyed everything. Because I was wrong about Rick, wrong about us, wrong about everything. Because her voice broke. Because Trevor would want you to. The mention of their son hit like a physical blow. Diane had lost the right to invoke Trevor's memory the night she chose her affair over her family. But she was desperate enough to try anyway. Meet me at Denny's on Powell Boulevard in an hour, Vinny said. Come alone. She was waiting in a corner booth when he arrived, looking smaller and older than he remembered. Her expensive clothes were wrinkled. Her makeup was smeared from crying, and her hands shook as she held her coffee cup. For a moment, Vinny felt a flicker of the old sympathy he'd once felt for her. Then he remembered Trevor asking why Mommy seemed sad during her hospital visits, not knowing his mother was distracted by text messages from her lover. I need you to know something, Vinny said, sliding into the booth across from her. I've known about Rick for 3 years. Diane's eyes widened. What? I knew he was a con man. I knew about the other women, the fake identities, the financial crimes. I knew he was planning to steal your house and disappear. Then why didn't you warn me? Vinny studied her face, looking for any trace of the woman he'd once loved. Because you made your choice. When you slapped me and told me to get out. When you chose him over our marriage, you chose whatever came next. But you could have saved me from this. Could I? Vinny leaned forward. What would you have done if I'd called you 3 years ago and told you Rick was a criminal? Would you have believed me? Or would you have accused me of lying because I was jealous? Diane's silence was answer enough. You threw away 15 years of marriage for a man you'd known 6 months, Vinny continued. You brought him into our house while our son's memory was still fresh. You chose to trust a stranger over your husband. So I let you live with the consequences of that choice. You let me get conned. I'll let you get exactly what you were looking for, a life without me in it. Diane started crying again, the ugly, desperate sobs of someone who'd lost everything through her own choices. What am I supposed to do now? Vinny pulled an envelope from his jacket and placed it on the table between them. Rick's real name is Robert Christopher Henley. He's been running cons for 15 years. The FBI has evidence of fraud in 6 states. His previous victims are suing him for millions. How do you know all this? Because I've been documenting his crimes since the week he moved into our house. Every financial transaction, every fake identity, every woman he's destroyed. I've been building a case against him for 8 years. Diane stopped crying, staring at him with growing comprehension. You planned this. You set him up. I gave him enough rope to hang himself. Rick destroyed his own life by being exactly who he was. I just made sure there were consequences. But what about me? I didn't know. You knew enough, Vinny interrupted. You knew I called his work and discovered he didn't exist. You knew his story kept changing. You knew he was pushing you to cut ties with everyone who cared about you. You chose to ignore every red flag because you wanted what he was selling. He stood up to leave, then paused. The FBI will probably offer you immunity if you cooperate fully. Tell them everything. When you met him, what he told you, how he controlled your finances. Help them build the strongest possible case. Why are you telling me this? Vinny looked down at the broken woman who'd once been his wife and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. Because I want Rick to spend the maximum possible time in federal prison. And I want you to live with knowing that you chose him over us. He walked away, leaving her alone with the wreckage of the life she'd chosen. But the reckoning was far from over. Chapter 8. The Trial of Consequences. Rick's federal trial began 14 months later, in June of the following year. By then, the case had grown into one of the largest fraud prosecutions in Oregon history. 7 victims testified about how Rick had systematically destroyed their lives. The FBI presented evidence of over $2 million in theft across multiple states. Financial experts explained the sophisticated laundering schemes he'd used to hide his crimes. But the prosecution's most devastating witness was Diane herself. She testified for 3 days, describing in excruciating detail how Rick had manipulated her emotions, isolated her from support systems, and gradually taken control of her finances. Her testimony was compelling precisely because she wasn't trying to excuse her own behavior. She admitted to every poor choice, every ignored warning sign, every moment when she'd chosen to trust Rick over her own instincts. The defense tried to paint her as a willing accomplice, but the evidence was overwhelming. Rick had run the same con on 7 other women, using identical tactics and manipulation strategies. Diane was a victim, even if she'd made herself an easy target through her own selfishness and poor judgment. Vinny attended every day of the trial, sitting in the back of the courtroom like a silent witness to justice. He watched Rick try to charm the jury, watched him blame his victims for their gullibility, watched him show no remorse for the devastation he'd caused. When the guilty verdict was read, guilty on all 23 federal counts, Rick finally lost his composure. He screamed at the judge that he'd been framed, that his victims were liars, that the system was corrupt. U.S. Marshals had to physically restrain him as he was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. After the sentencing, Diane approached Vinny in the courthouse hallway. She'd spent the past year working as a cashier at a grocery store, living in a studio apartment, and attending court-mandated financial counseling. The experience had aged her, but there was something different in her eyes, a humility that hadn't been there before. "I know you'll never forgive me," she said quietly, "but I wanted to thank you for giving me the information I needed to help convict him." "I didn't do it for you," Vinny replied. "I did it for justice." "I know. I also know that you could have destroyed me completely if you'd wanted to. The fact that you didn't. Don't mistake necessity for mercy," Vinny cut her off. "You were useful to the prosecution. That's the only reason you're not in federal prison yourself." Diane nodded, accepting the harsh truth. "What happens now? Now you live with the consequences of your choices, just like I've lived with mine." She started to walk away, then turned back. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if things had been different? If I'd chosen you instead of him?" Vinny considered the question seriously. "No," he said finally, "because the woman who would have chosen me over him wouldn't have been having an affair in the first place." After Diane left, Vinny remained in the courthouse for another hour, thinking about justice and revenge and the difference between the two. Rick would spend the next 18 years in federal prison, where his charm and manipulation skills would be useless. His victims would receive restitution from seized assets, though money could never fully repair the damage he'd done. But for Vinny, the real victory wasn't Rick's imprisonment. It was the knowledge that he'd transformed his rage and grief into something purposeful. He'd taken the worst betrayal of his life and turned it into justice for people who'd never expected to see any. That evening, he drove to Riverside Cemetery and sat beside Trevor's grave. The headstone was simple: Trevor James Delacroix, beloved son, dreamer of impossible cars. "It's finished," he said aloud. "The man who hurt our family is in prison. The woman who betrayed us is living with the consequences." Justice was served. The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, Vinny could almost hear his son's voice. "Good job, Dad." But what happens next? What happened next was the question that would define the rest of Vinny's life. He'd spent 8 years planning and executing the perfect revenge. Now, he had to decide what to do with the rest of his time on Earth. As he drove home to his small apartment above the Vietnamese restaurant, Vinny made a decision that would surprise everyone who thought they knew him. But that story would unfold in the final chapter of his transformation from grieving father to something much more dangerous. Chapter 9. 8 years later. The courtroom was packed on a gray November morning 8 years after Rick's conviction. Vinny sat at the plaintiff's table, wearing an expensive suit and the confident bearing of a man who'd rebuilt his life from ashes. Across the aisle, Diane sat with her court-appointed attorney, looking tired and defeated. Between them sat the reason for this final confrontation: Kyle Morrison, Rick's former cellmate who'd been released from federal prison 6 months earlier. Kyle had tracked down Diane with a story about Rick's secret stash of money hidden before his arrest. According to Kyle, Rick had told him about $300,000 buried in a storage unit, money that rightfully belonged to his wife. All Diane had to do was pay Kyle $50,000 for the location, and she could reclaim the hidden fortune. It was, of course, another con. Kyle was a career criminal who specialized in preying on previous fraud victims, using information gathered from fellow inmates to run secondary scams. He'd approached dozens of Rick's victims with similar stories, collecting finder's fees for treasure that didn't exist. But Kyle had made a critical error in targeting Diane. He'd underestimated how thoroughly Vinny had documented every aspect of Rick's criminal operation. "Your Honor," Vinny's attorney began, "8 years ago, my client discovered that his wife was having an affair with a career criminal. Rather than simply divorce her, Mr. Delacroix spent years building a federal case that resulted in the conviction of Robert Henley and the recovery of over $2 million for his victims." The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, reviewed the case file with obvious interest. This wasn't a typical civil matter. Mr. Delacroix maintained surveillance on Mr. Henley's operation for 3 years before the arrest, the attorney continued. During that time, he documented every financial transaction, every hidden asset, every criminal contact. There is no secret stash of money because my client accounted for every dollar Rick Henley stole. Kyle's attorney, a public defender who clearly wished he was anywhere else, made a weak argument about new evidence and recovered assets. But when Vinny's team presented 8 years of financial records, surveillance footage, and FBI cooperation agreements, Kyle's story collapsed completely. More damaging was the revelation that Kyle had been working this same scam across multiple states, targeting at least 30 victims with promises of hidden money that never existed. The FBI had been building a case against him, and his attempt to defraud Diane provided the final evidence they needed. But the real surprise came when the judge asked why Vinny was pursuing this case so aggressively. "Mr. Delacroix," she said, "you've already seen Mr. Henley convicted and imprisoned. Your ex-wife's financial situation isn't legally your responsibility. Why invest significant resources in stopping this relatively small fraud?" Vinny stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Diane's face. "Your Honor, 8 years ago my wife chose to destroy our marriage for a criminal who was planning to steal her life savings. I could have warned her, could have saved her from becoming a victim. Instead, I let her experience the full consequences of trusting the wrong person." The courtroom was completely silent. "I thought that would be enough," Vinny continued. "I thought watching her lose everything would satisfy my need for justice. But I was wrong. The real lesson wasn't about the consequences of betrayal. It was about the difference between justice and revenge." He gestured toward Kyle. "This man is a predator who targets people when they're most vulnerable. He specifically chose my ex-wife because he believed she was an easy mark, someone who'd already proven she could be manipulated by criminals." Vinny's voice grew harder. "I spent 8 years documenting Rick Henley's crimes not just for revenge, but to protect his future victims. Today, I'm here to ensure that Mr. Morrison faces consequences for his crimes, and that no one else falls victim to his scams." The judge studied Vinny for a long moment. "And what about your ex-wife? What consequences does she face in your version of justice?" "She faces the same consequence she's faced for 8 years, Your Honor. She has to live with the knowledge that her choices destroyed everything we built together, including our son's memory of a united family." For the first time during the proceedings, Diane spoke up. "Our son died before any of this happened. Don't use Trevor's memory to justify. Don't." Vinny's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "Don't you dare invoke our son's name. You were cheating on our marriage while he was dying. You brought your lover into our house 2 weeks after we buried him. You chose your affair over Trevor's memory, and you chose it again every day for 8 years. Diane stood up, tears streaming down her face. "I know I was wrong. I know I destroyed everything. But holding on to this anger for 8 years, Trevor wouldn't want. Trevor would want his father to protect innocent people from predators," Vinny interrupted. "He would want justice for victims who can't fight for themselves. And he would want the people who betrayed his family to face real consequences, not just convenient forgiveness." The judge banged her gavel, restoring order. After reviewing the evidence, she ruled in Vinny's favor on all counts. Kyle Morrison was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for fraud. Diane was ordered to pay restitution for her role in attempting to access the non-existent hidden money. But more importantly, the judge ordered a full investigation into Kyle's other victims, potentially bringing justice to dozens of people who'd been scammed by Rick's former cellmate. As the courtroom cleared, Diane approached Vinny one final time. "When does it end?" she asked quietly. "When you finally let go of the anger?" Vinny looked at the woman who'd once been his wife, the mother of his dead son, the person who'd chosen betrayal over loyalty when he needed her most. "It ends when justice is served completely. When every predator who targeted you faces consequences. When every victim gets restitution. When a system that failed to protect people like you is fixed. And then I move on to the next case. Because there's always another Rick Henley, another Kyle Morrison, another person who thinks they could destroy innocent lives without consequences." Diane stared at him with something approaching fear. "What did you become?" Vinny straightened his tie and picked up his briefcase. "I became someone who doesn't forgive or forget. Someone who believes that justice delayed is justice denied. Someone who understands that the only way to stop predators is to make them afraid of the consequences. He walked away, leaving Diane alone with the weight of her choices and the knowledge that some betrayals create enemies that never stop hunting. Outside the courthouse, Vinny's phone rang. It was Marcus Wade, calling about a new case, a veteran who'd been defrauded by a fake charity. Another victim who needed justice. Another predator who needed to learn that some people fight back. Vinny smiled as he answered the call. This was what he'd become, a weapon wielded by the wronged against those who wronged them. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life his experiences had forged. And somewhere in the distance, he could almost hear Trevor's voice saying, "Good job, Dad. Now help the next person." The transformation was complete. Vincent Delacroix, the trusting husband and grieving father, was gone forever. In his place stood something far more dangerous. A man who'd learned that mercy was weakness, forgiveness was surrender, and justice was the only currency that mattered in a world full of predators. 8 years after his wife's betrayal had destroyed his old life, Vinny had built something new from the ashes. Something that would ensure no one who wronged him, or people like him, would ever escape the consequences of their choices. Justice was served. The hunt for the next predator began immediately. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.